guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Unique Items. Today we're going to be taking a look at another one of the unique items in Diablo 4, which is the Fields of Crimson. The Fields of Crimson has undergone some crazy changes over the past couple patches. From the first video I made, where I land blasted it for being like one of the worst items in the game, and I swear the developers watched my video because like everything that I complained about in that video was fixed or changed. And, I'm not mad about that. Maybe send me a paycheck next time, though. Uh, Now, the Fields of Crimson unique two-handed sword is still a little lackluster, just simply because there's a really other good sword that you can put in that slot called the Grandfather. But if you don't happen to have the Grandfather, this could be an interesting one for Rupture. Let's go over it together. Let's talk about the changes they made to it and whether or not it's worth using now. First off, they gave it a massive 130% vulnerable damage on there. Just a flat, passive vulnerable damage, which of course is going to help things like your bleeding nodes. So if you're utilizing the hemorrhage, hemorrhage is going to give you a 45 times multiplier, or up to a 45 times multiplier for your bleeding damage for your vulnerable modifier. So that's going to help quite a bit in reaching that 45 times multiplier. On top of this, it also gives a 198 to 270 strength bonus, which of course is how barbarians scale damage, including a 406 to 550% damage to bleeding enemies. Now, this is not damage for bleeding, this is damage to bleeding enemies, which is a little bit different. So this is as long as the monster is bleeding at all, you gain this bonus, which means that you don't technically have to actually be using bleeds for this. You just have to make sure that the monster has at least some kind of bleeding effect on them at some point, which is super easy to do with something like Tough as Nails, which basically just makes monsters bleed when they hit you because of your thorns. So they hit you, you have thorns, they take bleeding damage, and they're bleeding for 5 seconds every single time they hit you, which means that you would get this bonus regardless of whether or not you're actually a bleed setup. On top of this, it also has a enhanced rupture explosion size of 52 to 70%, and Rupture has always been an AoE ability, and it's one of the things that I complain about, is that it's a really small AoE ability. And that might sound kind of silly, but when you actually use it and you see like kind of how big the explosion is, it really only hits like a small little area, and the monsters have to basically be all stacked up on top of each other for you to be able to hit more than one monster. So having a enhanced Rupture explosion size is nice, because it's going to hit obviously a lot more monsters than just the tiny bit that it was hitting before. On top of this, it also has a cooldown reduction of up to 25%, which is very nice, and obviously that's going to make it so that you can spam your Rupture. The problem is, however, is that Rupture pulls off all the bleeds, and the only aspect that can make Rupture not pull off all the bleeds, which is called Wonton Rupture, or Wonton something, I can't remember the name of it. But basically what it does is it makes it so that every certain number of seconds your Rupture won't pull a bleed. So attacking with Rupture faster doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you're going with some sort of other build where Rupture is like your main skill or something. On top of this, it also has a special effect, which is while using this weapon, damaging at least one enemy with Rupture creates a blood pool that inflicts 2,868 bleeding damage over 6 seconds. Enemies standing in the pool take 30% times increased damage. Now, Rupture is a skill that I've used tremendously well in the past, and unfortunately I don't have that character set up right now, but one of the things about Rupture involves about stacking huge amounts of bleed on a target, and then using Rupture to obviously pull that bleed damage and dish it out damage physically. Now, that doesn't really function very well, and I've played around with this a lot when it comes to Rupture, is that like in general with Rupture, if you're pulling the bleed damage off, you're kind of just defeating the purpose, because you want that bleed damage stacking as high as you possibly can. But with the Wonton Rupture aspect, you can basically set it up so that the damage isn't actually coming off, which basically doubles your damage, right? So this actually doubles the amount of damage that you could potentially have. So if you've got, say, I don't know, like 12 million bleed damage on a target, and you pull off all that bleed damage, but it doesn't actually come off, and the monster's still ticking for 12 million bleed damage, and you get your Rupture off too, then it actually works a hell of a lot better. And so if you're going to use Rupture, I highly recommend that you use the aspect that makes it so that Rupture doesn't pull the bleed damage, because it's going to make it a hell of a lot easier to utilize.
Mr. Goody Two Shoes, Mr. Goody Two Shoes. Ginger Evil Mentor here. Why bother farming when you can go to MMOEXP.com and simply purchase your items in gold? GGM would have you farm the items. What a pathetic being. Use code GEM Ginger Evil Mentor for 6% off your entire purchase. And don't tell Ginger Gaming Mentor that I was here.
The pool that comes out and gives you a multiplier for your bleed damage is also kind of nice, and utilizing Rupture in this way specifically just to get the pool, which gives you the increased damage, is also not bad. Rupture itself also comes with a very nice increased attack speed, which can come in handy if you're just trying to get the increased attack speed. So like reducing the cooldown for Rupture, even if you're not a bleed barbarian, you could potentially just be, you know, obviously using Rupture to get the 40% increased attack speed and then continuing your normal rotation, which isn't exactly a terrible idea either. All in all, Fields of Crimson has basically one purpose. It's to enhance, obviously, your Rupture and your bleeding damage, right? It is a bleed sword, specifically. And to be honest, if you're not using Rupture, it's not really the greatest sword out there because it's so focused around Rupture. The effect is focused around Rupture. The Rupture cooldown is obviously Rupture. The Rupture size is Rupture. So, like, the entire sword, pretty much, for the most part, is just focused way too much around Rupture. And if you're not using Rupture, don't even touch the sword. The other problem is, like I said, it competes very much with, like, the Grandfather sword for this spot and a lot of other really nice weapons. It's also a two-handed weapon, so it competes with two-handed aspects, basically, that could potentially be going here. Like maybe you want a double effectiveness rapid aspect for 60% increased attack speed, or maybe you want, you know, like a double effectiveness limitless rage, etc. Like there's definitely other aspects that could potentially go here that would enhance your damage more. It really is going to be up to how much you're utilizing Rupture and what you're utilizing Rupture for. The flavor text on this says, "We've been fighting these flesh eaters for so long, been soaked in so much blood that after a while it's difficult to tell what side you're truly on. And Dalier Crane Tribe Warrior." I will leave you with this. I've done Bleed Barbarians, many of them, and I've tried to add Fields of Crimson into those builds. And I gotta say that not a single one of my Bleed Barbarians has ever used Fields of Crimson as their end-game best in slot item. A lot of the times it was Grandfather. A lot of the times I took it off for another two-handed aspect. The thing is that like spamming Rupture isn't really what you want to do. If you're a Bleed Barbarian, you really just don't want to spam Rupture. You use it when you need it tactically, but you don't want to spam it at every single opportunity because it can ruin your damage output by pulling the bleeds, and when you pull the bleeds, you have to then rebuild everything back up. And while it does do some decent damage, I mean, I will admit it is useful when it is useful. But if you use the Wonton aspect and you don't pull the bleeds, you're actually trying not to spam it. You kind of want to just use it at the beginning of a rotation for the enhanced speed. And then eventually it gets to the point where you're moving more toward just kind of like saving it for that moment when you get your bleed stacked up really high. You pop your Rupture, you do massive amounts of damage, and then you move on. Rupture's a good skill at this point. I do like the way that Rupture works, and it's definitely a 180 from before where I thought Rupture was absolutely terrible and I wouldn't include it in basically any of my bleed builds because it sucked. And this does obviously enhance Rupture, but I don't know if it enhances Rupture enough to really make it into a viable option over other options that you might have in this regard. Obviously, the blood pool is kind of fun. Having this blood pool around, you know, is interesting. I mean, even last season, I think I was using the Flay Barbarian. It was my fun build, and I was actually hitting really freaking hard. I was like 1 billion damage in a single hit, and I was using Rupture. I was, but I wasn't spamming it, and I wasn't using Fields of Crimson. I think that's pretty much all I got to say on Fields of Crimson now. It's definitely a lot better than it was before. I'm not like upset at how terrible it is anymore. It's just there's a lot better options now, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm ever going to fit it into a build. It makes me kind of sad because I put so much effort into figuring out what was wrong with it, and then when they fixed what was wrong with it, it still doesn't quite live up to the expectation of other items that you could put in the same slot. If you want to find this, you can take a look on Diablo 4.life. We got a target farming tool, and it does come from Echo of Varshan and Beast in the Ice. I'm sure that you'll have plenty of these, probably way more than you'll ever want. And as you compare them and figure out which one is the best, you'll probably have like a nearly perfect Fields of Crimson sitting in your stash that unfortunately you might never use. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals joining me for these fun videos, even when we're just talking about Fields of Crimson. And as always, be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button, and keep watching.